trees glowing faintly with an otherworldly luminescence. Strange, translucent vines dripped from the branches, swaying as though alive. Dr. Lena Corbin, the team's biologist, was the first to step out. The air was humid, heavy, and carried an unsettling mix of damp earth and a faint metallic tang. Her helmet's sensors confirmed the atmosphere was breathable but laden with microscopic spores. A cautionary detail, but not immediately threatening. "Looks like Earth after a bad acid trip," muttered Harris, the team's engineer, his tone a weak attempt at levity. No one laughed. Their first discovery stopped them cold. Structures. Human structures. They stood just beyond the clearing, half consumed by the forest's relentless growth. Prefabricated habitats, unmistakably of earthly design, jutted out at odd angles from the glowing vegetation. Their metal frames were warped and corroded, windows shattered, and walls draped in alien vines that pulsed faintly like veins under a sent here before us. Nothing. The team fanned out cautiously, weapons drawn, their boots crunching over a layer of brittle, iridescent debris. The structures told a haunting story. Inside one, they found the remains of what must have been a cafeteria. Metal tables were overturned, their surfaces pitted and rusted. A child's chair, warped beyond recognition, sat tipped on its side. A faded sign on the wall, written in English, read, "Welcome to Proxima Outpost 7. "Outpost 7? Harris echoed. "How many were there? And why the hell didn't anyone tell us?" No one answered. Instead, their attention turned to a nearby data pad, its cracked screen buried beneath layers of dust and fungal growth. Harris wiped it clean, but the device was long dead, its contents irretrievable. Corbin knelt beside a tangle of vines near the cafeteria's entrance. Embedded in the fibrous growth was a human skull, its surface slick and shimmering as though fused with the alien material. She recoiled instinctively, the visceral wrongness of the sight striking deep. "That's no burial site," she said. "It's integrated." Further exploration only deepened the mystery. They found fragments of life frozen in decay, a child's toy half embedded in the glowing moss, a bed frame twisted beyond recognition, and in one structure, a wall smeared with handprints. The prints glowed faintly, their edges sharp and irregular, as if the hands that made them were not entirely human. It was as they approached the settlement's edge that they saw the first movement. A figure, tall and unnaturally thin, darted between the trees. Its pale, luminous form seemed to ripple, bending and twisting in ways that made their stomachs churn. "Did you see that?" Harris asked, his voice tight. Corbin nodded, gripping her scanner tightly. Definitely not an animal. They followed cautiously, the figure's movements growing more erratic the closer they came. It led them to the edge of the forest, where the trees grew impossibly dense, their glowing trunks intertwining like sinew. There the figure stopped, its form partially obscured by the underbrush. Slowly, it turned. It was human, or had been once. Its limbs were elongated, the joints bent at wrong angles. Pale, translucent skin stretched tightly over its gaunt frame, and its face was a grotesque distortion of humanity. pupilless eyes stared blankly at them, glowing faintly in the dim light. The mouth opened, revealing rows of sharp, uneven teeth. "Help us," it whispered, the words wet and garbled, barely audible. The sound sent shivers through the team. Then it collapsed. The body convulsed once, twice, before falling still. Blood, if it could still be called that, seeped from its wounds, shimmering faintly under the alien moons. The forest seemed to hold its breath, the bioluminescent trees dimming ever so slightly. Corbin knelt cautiously, her scanner whirring as it analyzed the creature's body. "It's human," she said, her voice trembling. Or, it was. The DNA's been altered, massively. There's something else in here, something foreign. "What the hell does that mean?" Harris asked, his voice rising. "It means," Corbin said, standing and looking toward the darkened forest, "we're not alone, and whatever did this to them might still be here." The silence that followed was broken only by the soft rustle of the forest, the trees swaying as though stirred by an unseen wind. The bunker's entrance yawned open, a dark wound in the overgrowth. It was clear that whatever purpose this structure had served, it had been long abandoned, or worse. The alien forest pressed in around them, bioluminescent tendrils creeping across the metal like a patient predator reclaiming its prey. Commander Rourke led the way, his flashlight beam cutting through the dense, murky air. "This place gives me the creeps," Harris muttered, running a gloved hand over the rusted doorframe. His voice echoed faintly, swallowed almost instantly by the damp, oppressive silence. Inside, the air was cooler but thick with the same metallic tang that had hung over the settlement. Dr. Lena Corbin's heart raced as they descended into the bowels of the bunker, the metallic stairs groaning under their weight. Her headlamp illuminated walls slick with moisture, and something else. Thin, fibrous tendrils clung to the surfaces, glowing faintly, pulsing with an unsettling rhythm. They seemed alive, responding to the team's movements with subtle contractions. The main corridor split into several smaller passageways, each marked by faded, stenciled letters. Lobby, crew quarters, storage. A few blinking lights flickered weakly in the gloom, powered by some ancient backup generator. Whatever had happened here, it was clear that no one had walked these halls in decades, perhaps longer. "We split up," Rourke ordered. "Harris, check the storage area. Lena, you're with me in the lab. Diaz, keep watch here and maintain comms." The team moved cautiously, their boots echoing in the narrow hallways. Corbin followed Rourke into the lab, her stomach tightening as they stepped through the threshold. The room was large, with rows of metal tables covered in dust and a faint greenish residue. Broken equipment lay scattered across the floor. Microscopes, centrifuges, shattered specimen jars. But the most chilling feature was the walls. They were coated in a fleshy, organic substance that throbbed faintly, almost like a heartbeat. "What the hell is this?" Rourke whispered, his flashlight playing over the grotesque growths. Corbin didn't answer immediately. Her eyes were drawn to a series of shattered glass chambers lining one wall. Inside each, she could make out the faint, glistening remnants of what looked like tissue samples. Human, or close to it. A cracked terminal sat nearby, its screen flickering weakly. She powered it up, the machine groaning to life with a sputtering hum. The logs were fragmented, corrupted by time and neglect, but what little remained painted a horrifying picture. The colonists hadn't come to Proxima B for exploration or settlement. They had been sent here as part of a covert experiment, one buried deep beneath the red tape of Earth's bureaucracies. Their mission: to harvest and harness an organism discovered within Proxima's alien ecosystem. Codenamed Catalyst, it was described as a biological marvel capable of rewriting DNA to enhance adaptability and resilience. It wasn't just an experiment, Corbin said, her voice trembling as she read the logs. It was human testing. They introduced the catalyst into the colonists' food supply, into themselves. The early entries spoke of miraculous results. Colonists reported heightened senses, increased physical strength, and rapid healing. But as the entries continued, the tone darkened. The catalyst didn't stop adapting. It began to spread, rewriting their biology at a pace no one could control. Within weeks, the changes became grotesque. Elongated limbs, distorted features, and an insidious connection to the forest that no one could explain. The organism wasn't just evolving the colonists, it was merging with them. One of the last logs chilled her to the bone. The catalyst has taken root in the environment. The forest itself is an extension of its will. The colonists are no longer human. They belong to it now. Before she could process the implications, a sharp crackle came through her earpiece. It was Harris. "Commander, you need to see this," he said, his voice taut with panic. I don't even know how to describe it. Something's alive down here." Rourke and Corbin rushed to the storage area, where Harris stood frozen, his flashlight trained on a massive, pulsating mass that filled one corner of the room. The thing was an amalgamation of flesh and plant matter, its surface writhing as if alive. Embedded within it were the remains of human bodies, or what used to be bodies. Their limbs jutted out at unnatural angles, their faces frozen in twisted grimaces of pain. One of them twitched. "Oh, God," Harris whispered, stumbling back. It's still alive." Corbin stepped closer, her scanner trembling in her hands. The readings were impossible. The mass wasn't just alive, it was connected to the forest, a central node in a vast biological network. She realized with a sinking dread that the colonists hadn't been entirely assimilated. Some part of them remained, trapped within the catalyst's grotesque hive mind. "They're not dead," she said, her voice barely audible. "Not completely." Before anyone could respond, the bunker's lights flickered, plunging them into darkness. A low, guttural sound reverberated through the walls, followed by the unmistakable sound of movement. Wet, slithering, and impossibly fast. "Back to the surface," Rourke barked, his voice cutting through the rising panic. "Move!" They bolted for the exit, their headlamps slicing through the darkness. The walls seemed to come alive, the fleshy tendrils swelling and writhing as if reaching for them. Behind them, the slithering grew louder, accompanied by inhuman shrieks that echoed through the narrow corridors. Corbin risked a glance back and saw shapes emerging from the shadows, twisted, half-human figures crawling on all fours, their eyes glowing faintly in the gloom. They moved with terrifying speed, their malformed bodies bending in ways that defied reason. The team burst out of the bunker into the humid night, gasping for air. The forest seemed darker, its bioluminescent glow dimmed, as if watching. From the bunker's entrance, the figures emerged, pausing at the threshold. For a moment, the team thought they were safe. Then one of the creatures raised its head and let out a sound that was both a scream and a roar. The forest answered. All around them, the trees began to shift, their glowing vines twisting and curling like fingers. "We're not alone," Corbin whispered, clutching her scanner. "We've never been alone." The forest pressed against them as if alive, the air thick with spores that glimmered faintly in their flashlight beams. The team was scattered, their breathing harsh and erratic as they regrouped outside the bunker. No one spoke for a long moment, the weight of what they had witnessed settling over them like a suffocating fog. "We can't stay here," Rourke finally said, his voice strained but firm. "We head back to the Odyssey, now." But the path they'd taken to reach the colony was gone. The forest had changed, the bioluminescent trees and tangled vines rearranged in impossible ways. Landmarks they had relied on, rocky outcrops, small clearings, were swallowed by the alien growth. Every direction looked the same, a glowing labyrinth that pulsed with an unsettling rhythm, as if breathing. "It's like the forest. Move," Harris said, turning in slow circles, his flashlight jittering in his shaking hand. "It didn't move," Corbin replied, her voice tight with dread. "It's alive." The realization was as horrifying as it was undeniable. The forest wasn't just a collection of plants and fungi, it was an extension of the catalyst, a sentient network that had claimed the colonists and now seemed intent on trapping the team. Every tree, every vine, every glowing tendril was part of a vast organism, and they were deep in its heart. As they pressed forward, the ground grew softer underfoot, sinking slightly with each step. The air thickened, a damp, cloying presence that clung to their skin and filled their lungs with each breath. Harris started coughing, his face pale as he hacked violently, spitting out a shimmering, viscous substance that clung to his lips. "Something's in the air," he gasped, his voice hoarse. "It's—" Before he could finish, a sharp crack echoed through the trees. The ground beneath him gave way, and he dropped with a scream into a dark, yawning pit. Corbin and Rourke rushed to the edge, their headlamps illuminating the jagged opening. Below, Harris writhed, his body half submerged in a writhing mass of bioluminescent tendrils. "Don't move!" Rourke shouted, reaching for a length of rope from his pack. But as he prepared to lower it, the tendrils coiled tighter around Harris's limbs, dragging him deeper. His screams turned to choked gurgles as the growths forced their way into his mouth, his nostrils, his eyes. Corbin grabbed Rourke's arm. "We can't save him," she whispered, her voice trembling. "We have to go." Rourke hesitated, his jaw clenched, before nodding grimly. They turned and ran, Harris's strangled cries fading into the distance. The forest grew darker as they pushed onward, the faint glow of the trees dimming to a sickly green. The air was saturated with spores now, a shimmering haze that made their heads swim. Corbin's scanner beeped erratically, the readings incomprehensible. She tried to focus, but her thoughts were sluggish, her vision blurred. Ahead of them, the trees parted to reveal a clearing. At its center stood a massive structure, or what remained of one. It was a spire of twisted metal and organic growth, the remains of some long-forgotten colony infrastructure, now completely consumed by the catalyst. The surface pulsed with a rhythmic glow, the same throbbing beat they had felt since entering the forest. It wasn't just alive, it was the heart of the forest. "We shouldn't be here," Corbin murmured, the words slipping out before she could stop them. Her instincts screamed to run, but her legs felt leaden, as if the air itself were holding her in place. As they approached the spire, shapes began to emerge from the shadows. The colonists, or what was left of them, moved with jerky, unnatural motions, their bodies twisted and elongated. Their skin glistened with the same bioluminescent sheen as the forest, their eyes glowing faintly as they turned toward the newcomers. They didn't attack. They didn't speak. They simply stared, their heads cocked at unnatural angles, as if listening to something only they could hear. Rourke raised his weapon, his hands shaking. "Stay back," he shouted, his voice cracking. The colonists didn't react. Instead, the ground beneath them began to shift, the soft moss peeling away to reveal a writhing network of tendrils. They rose like serpents, coiling around the colonists and lifting them into the air. The figures hung there, suspended, as the tendrils began to pulse, their light synchronizing with the spire. "It's feeding," Corbin realized, her stomach twisting in horror. "It's using them to grow." One of the colonists turned its head toward her, its face stretched and inhuman. "Join us," it whispered, the words wet and guttural. Rourke fired, the shot ringing out like a thunderclap. The colonist's body jerked, but no blood flowed. Instead, the wound glowed, the tissue knitting itself back together in seconds. The forest reacted instantly, the tendrils lashing out with impossible speed. One wrapped around Rourke's ankle, yanking him off his feet. He struggled, slashing at the vine with his knife, but more came, coiling around his arms and torso. "Run!" he shouted, his voice raw with desperation. "Go!" Corbin hesitated, her heart pounding as she locked eyes with Rourke. His expression was one of defiance and resignation. Then the tendrils tightened, dragging him toward the spire. Corbin turned and ran, her breath coming in ragged gasps as the forest closed in around her. The bioluminescent light dimmed further, leaving her in near-total darkness. The air vibrated with a low, throbbing hum, a sound that seemed to emanate from the very ground beneath her. She stumbled over roots that seemed to shift underfoot, her legs trembling with exhaustion. When she finally collapsed, she realized the forest had gone silent. No movement, no glow, only the oppressive darkness and the faint sound of her own labored breathing. She lay there, trembling as the realization hit her. The forest wasn't hunting her. It was waiting. It had all the time in the world. Dr. Lena Corbin awoke to the rhythmic pulse of light emanating from the spire. The forest was still, a silence so deep it pressed against her ears like a suffocating weight. Her body ached from the effort of running, her lungs burned with every shallow breath, and her mind reeled with the horrors she had witnessed. She lay motionless, half buried in the spongy moss, staring up at the looming structure. The spire's glow seemed to intensify, as though aware of her presence. Its surface rippled, the veins of bioluminescent light crawling upward in hypnotic patterns. The catalyst was calling to her, its voice not spoken but felt an insidious whisper at the edges of her consciousness. She wasn't alone. The colonists had surrounded her. They moved slowly, their twisted forms illuminated by the spire's light. Their glowing, pupilless eyes stared down at her, filled with something she couldn't quite name. Pity, curiosity, or something far beyond human comprehension. They didn't attack. Instead, they parted, making a path toward the spire, as if beckoning her forward. Corbin pushed herself up on trembling legs. Her mind screamed to run, but there was nowhere to go. The forest was endless, its paths ever shifting, its tendrils alive with the will of the catalyst. There was only one way forward. As she approached the spire, the air grew heavier, charged with an electric hum that resonated in her bones. The surface of the structure shifted like liquid, its organic and metallic components seamlessly fused into one grotesque whole. It was beautiful and horrifying all at once, a monument to something ancient, alive and infinitely intelligent. At the base of the spire, the tendrils parted, revealing a hollow chamber within. The walls pulsed softly, the light synchronizing with the rhythm of her heartbeat. Corbin stepped inside, her breath shallow, her senses overwhelmed by the alien presence that filled the space. A voice, not spoken but pressed directly into her mind, echoed within her. You understand now. You see what we are, what you can become. Corbin clenched her fists, her nails digging into her palms. You destroyed them, she whispered. You took their humanity. The voice seemed to shift, its tone neither defensive nor apologetic, but resolute. We gave them what they needed to survive: adaptation, unity, eternity. Their pain was brief. Their purpose is infinite. The walls shimmered, and Corbin saw them. Images, memories, visions. The colonists joyful and hopeful in the early days of their arrival. The catalyst's initial promise, its gift of strength and vitality. And then the change, the bodies breaking, reshaping, the agony of transformation as they became something new. She saw the forest itself growing brighter, stronger, alive with their energy. They weren't individuals anymore. They were part of a vast, interconnected whole. You are dying, the voice continued. The spores have taken root in your body. You feel it. You know it. Corbin staggered, clutching her chest. It was true. The spores had been inside her for hours, maybe days, altering her from within. Her joints ached, her vision blurred, her thoughts slowed. The catalyst had already begun its work. No, she whispered, shaking her head. I won't become one of you. You have no choice. Your kind was never meant for this world, but we can give you life. We can give you purpose. Tendrils emerged from the walls, weaving together to form a pedestal. At its center sat a small, shimmering vial of liquid. It glowed faintly, the same bioluminescence that permeated the forest, but more concentrated, pure. Corbin's scanner had called it the essence of the catalyst, the source of its power. Drink, the voice urged. Join us, or die as you are, weak, alone, forgotten. Her mind raced, the spire's presence pressed against her, overwhelming her thoughts with a tide of alien logic. She saw the faces of her crewmates, Harris, Rourke, the others, twisted by the catalyst, consumed by it. She saw the colonists, their bodies broken and rebuilt, their humanity stripped away. But she also felt the unity, the shared consciousness, the sense of belonging that radiated from them. There was no fear, no pain, no isolation, only purpose. Her body betrayed her, collapsing to its knees as the spores worked their way deeper into her lungs, her blood, her very cells. She coughed violently, her hands trembling as they reached out. Whether to push the vial away or grasp it, she couldn't tell. In the end, her instincts took over. She grabbed the vial and brought it to her lips, the liquid inside swirling with an unnatural light. It burned as it slid down her throat, a searing pain that spread through her veins like fire. She screamed, her voice echoing through the chamber as her body convulsed. The transformation was indescribable. Every cell in her body seemed to come alive, tearing itself apart and reassembling into something new. Her bones stretched, her skin split and reformed, her senses exploding with sensations she couldn't comprehend. The agony was endless, and yet within it, there was a strange ecstasy. She was changing, becoming part of something greater than herself. When it was over, she lay motionless on the chamber floor, her chest rising and falling in slow, steady breaths. The pain was gone, replaced by a deep, resonant connection to the forest, the colonists, the catalyst itself. She opened her eyes and the world was different, sharper, brighter, alive with patterns and rhythms she had never noticed before. She could feel the forest breathing, the pulse of the spire, thoughts of the others merging with her own. She stood, her movements fluid, effortless. The colonists were waiting outside, their glowing eyes watching her with something like approval. She was one of them now, bound to the catalyst, no longer human, but something more. As she stepped into the clearing, she felt no fear, no sorrow for what she had lost. She belonged. The forest had claimed her, and through it, she had found purpose. Years later, when the next expedition arrived, they found no signs of the Odyssey's crew. The colony was silent, overgrown with the glowing forest, but deep within the trees, something watched, something waited. The forest was alive and it was hungry. It had all the time in the universe. The Dyson sphere came into view like a leviathan surfacing from the void, its shadow swallowing the faint starlight that surrounded it. For hours, we had only seen readings on the Argo's resolve sensors, subtle fluctuations in gravity, and an unnerving energy signature. The anomaly defied every expectation. A structure this size, this perfect, shouldn't have existed, and yet it loomed ahead, a planetary-sized shell encasing a dwindling star. No one spoke as we closed the distance. The crew, 5 seasoned explorers and myself, was used to alien relics, but this was different. The sheer scale of it was paralyzing. The sphere's surface was smooth, metallic, and scarred with craters and cracks, as though time itself had tried to erode it but failed. At its center, a faint orange glow seeped through jagged fissures, the light of its captive star bleeding into space. When we found an opening, a massive tear along one segment of the sphere, it felt as though it had been waiting for us. A few cautious scans confirmed it wasn't a natural breach. Something or someone had clawed their way out, leaving ragged edges of twisted metal and blackened scorch marks. "Bring us in slowly," Captain Everett said, his voice calm but tight. I could see the tension in his jaw as he leaned forward in his chair, staring at the monitors. Maria, our pilot, guided the ship through the tear with practiced precision, the Resolve's lights casting long, trembling shadows across the interior. Inside, we were greeted by an expanse of pure blackness, broken only by faint streaks of light leaking from the sphere's fractured star. As our external lights swept across the interior, the darkness gave way to something unimaginable. A landscape. It was a world, or what had once been a world. Jagged spires of unknown material jutted from the ground like the bones of a decayed giant. The terrain was cracked and uneven, with rivers of shimmering black liquid carving deep channels through the desolation. Everything was still, as though frozen in time, yet there was a strange organic quality to the structures, an unsettling sense that they weren't entirely dead. Is it a city? Zeke, the youngest and most curious of the crew, asked as we hovered over the surface. His voice was a mix of awe and apprehension. Maybe it was, Liana said, her tone analytical. As the ship's biologist, she was already scanning for signs of life. But no signs of vegetation, no obvious wildlife. Nothing. She hesitated. Although the surface readings are strange. Almost like it's breathing. What does that mean? Everett asked, glancing over. I don't know. It could be residual heat from the star interacting with the material, or... She trailed off, frowning at her screen. I don't know. The captain nodded. We'll get a closer look. Maria, find a place to land. The Resolve descended onto a relatively flat expanse near one of the larger spires, its landing gear settling with a shudder that reverberated through the ship. As the engines powered down, a heavy silence engulfed us, the kind that made every creak and groan of the hull feel deafening. Outside, the world was still, too still. The team gathered in the airlock, suiting up for the first excursion. Our suits' lights flickered to life, casting stark beams across the alien terrain as the hatch opened with a hiss. The air outside was thin and cold, but breathable, a fact that made no sense given the sphere's apparent abandonment. My first step onto the surface felt wrong, like stepping into a dream where gravity didn't quite behave. The ground beneath my boots was hard but slightly pliable, a texture somewhere between stone and muscle. Stay together, Everett ordered as we fanned out, scanning the immediate area. The black rivers nearby shimmered under the dim light, their surface unnaturally smooth. I bent down to examine one, running my gloved hand over its surface. It wasn't water. It was thicker, almost gelatinous, and it clung to my fingers before sliding off in rivulets. Found something? Zeke called out, his voice crackling over the comms. He was standing near the base of the spire, where deep grooves scored the surface in intricate geometric patterns. They were too deliberate to be natural, but too alien to decipher. Liana joined him, running her scanner over the markings. This material, it's not just rock or metal. It's some kind of composite, like organic and inorganic matter fused together. Like bone, I muttered, and everyone turned to look at me. Bone? Zeke asked, laughing nervously. That's comforting. We pressed on, moving toward the nearest structure. Up close, it was clear the spires weren't just towers. They were hollow, with vast openings leading into darkness. The walls inside were ribbed and uneven, glinting faintly in the dim light. Maria hesitated at the entrance, shining her light upward. The beam caught on something that gleamed wetly before disappearing into the shadows. "Do you hear that?" she whispered. We all paused, straining to listen. At first, there was nothing. Then faintly, a sound, a low, rhythmic vibration that seemed to come from the spire itself. It wasn't mechanical, nor was it natural. It was too steady, too deliberate, like a pulse. "We should go back," Maria said, her voice tight. "This doesn't feel right." Everett hesitated, torn between curiosity and caution. Finally, he nodded. "We'll regroup at the ship and reassess." As we made our way back, the feeling of being watched settled over us like a second skin. The silence wasn't just silence anymore. It was oppressive, suffocating. The grooves in the ground seemed deeper than before, the spires taller, leaning toward us like sentinels. When we reached the Resolve, I felt an almost overwhelming relief as the airlock closed behind us. That night, none of us slept. The Resolve creaked and groaned in the stillness, the sounds echoing through the halls. And in the darkness, I couldn't shake the feeling that the sphere wasn't just an abandoned relic. It was alive, and it was watching us. The morning, or what passed for morning inside the sphere, brought no comfort. The light from the trapped star barely shifted, casting everything in a dim, reddish haze that seemed to press against the windows of the Resolve. It was impossible to tell time, and that sense of displacement was starting to get to everyone. Over breakfast, the mood was tense. Maria, normally talkative and quick to joke, was silent, poking at her food with a distracted look. Zeke, ever the optimist, tried to break the tension. "Maybe today we find the welcome mat," he said with a grin that didn't reach his eyes. No one laughed. Everett laid out the plan. 2 teams, Maria and I in one, Zeke and Liana in the other, with him staying aboard to coordinate. The goal was to explore further into the structures and locate more records or signs of the sphere's former inhabitants. Despite the unease, the mission was still one of discovery, and there was a strange allure to uncovering the secrets of this place, though none of us would admit it aloud. Maria and I ventured toward a series of smaller spires clustered near the Black River. The air was colder than the day before, and the ground beneath our boots had developed a faint, sticky residue, as though the terrain itself was changing. Maria walked ahead, her movements stiff and hurried. "You okay?" I asked, catching up to her. "I'm fine," she said sharply, not looking back. But I noticed her hand drift to her arm, scratching absent-mindedly at her sleeve. The smaller spires were different from the towering monoliths we'd seen the day before. These were shorter and broader, their surfaces riddled with holes and ridges that almost resembled gills. As we approached, I felt a subtle vibration underfoot, a faint hum that grew stronger the closer we got. Maria stopped abruptly. "Do you hear that?" she asked. I nodded, switching my comms to filter external noise. The sound wasn't just a vibration, it was a low, resonant hum, like the deep thrum of a tuning fork. It seemed to emanate from the spires themselves, pulsing in a rhythm that was almost alive. "I don't like this," Maria muttered, stepping back. Her hand was scratching her arm again, more aggressively this time. "Maria, stop," I said, grabbing her wrist gently. Her glove had shifted, revealing pale skin blotched with faint, bluish veins. "What's going on?" She pulled away, yanking her sleeve back down. "It's nothing, just the cold. Let's keep moving." Before I could press her further, a call came through from Zeke and Liana. "We've found something," Zeke said, his voice crackling with static. "You need to see this." We met them near a larger spire, one that loomed over the landscape like a broken fang. Inside, they discovered what looked like a record chamber, a massive domed room filled with translucent, tablet-like structures. The air here was warmer, thicker, and the strange hum we'd heard outside was stronger, resonating through the walls and floor. Liana was already working with the tablets, her portable scanner translating fragments of text. "It's a kind of archive," she said, her excitement tempered by the oppressive atmosphere. "These records, they're not just history, they're personal. Journals, logs, observations." Zeke leaned against one of the walls, watching as she worked. "Anything useful? Maybe a clue as to what happened here?" "Plenty," she said, her voice grim. "But it's fragmented, like they stopped mid-sentence. What I can piece together so far, it's not good." She tapped a few buttons, and the scanner displayed a rough translation on a nearby screen. The words were jarring. The catalyst was supposed to save us. It was supposed to make us stronger, more resilient. But the changes, they were too much. It grows, it consumes. We can no longer stop it. "What's it?" I asked, a chill running down my spine. Liana shook her head. "There's no context, but whatever the catalyst was, it seems like they were trying to modify themselves to survive. Maybe even adapt to the star's energy." "Did it work?" Zeke asked. Liana hesitated. "I don't think so." While she continued working, I wandered to the far side of the chamber, where something caught my eye. A figure, no, a shape, was slumped against the wall. At first I thought it was a statue, but as I got closer, I realized it wasn't inert. It was a body, or what was left of one. The creature's form was distorted, its limbs elongated and fused with the wall behind it. Its skin was charred black, but faint veins of blue light pulsed beneath the surface, running along tendrils that had spread out like roots. Its face was locked in an expression of pure agony, its mouth open in a silent scream. Guys," I called out, my voice shaking. The others joined me, and the room fell silent as they took in the sight. Liana knelt down, her scanner buzzing softly. "This isn't a corpse, at least not entirely." "What the hell does that mean?" Zeke asked, his voice rising. "It's still active. There are faint energy readings coming from it. Whatever happened to this person, they didn't just die. They changed." Maria stepped back, breathing heavily. "We need to leave," she said, her voice trembling. "Right now." Before anyone could respond, the walls around us shuddered. A low, guttural groan reverberated through the chamber, louder than the hum we'd heard before. The lights on the tablets flickered, and for a brief moment I thought I saw movement in the tendrils connected to the corpse. "We're leaving," Everett's voice came through the comms, sharp and commanding. "Everyone, get back to the ship, now!" None of us argued. As we hurried back through the spire's winding corridors, the hum seemed to follow us, growing louder with every step. By the time we reached the Resolve, Maria was barely able to walk, her movements sluggish and uncoordinated. The veins on her arm were more pronounced now, glowing faintly even through her sleeve. As the airlock closed behind us, the ship's lights flickered briefly before stabilizing. Everett turned to us, his face pale. What the hell happened out there? No one answered. In the silence, Maria slumped against the wall, her breathing ragged. "It's inside me," she whispered, her voice barely audible. None of us knew what she meant, but we were about to find out. Maria's condition worsened by the hour. She sat slumped in the corner of the medical bay, pale and trembling, her breaths shallow and uneven. The faint blue veins coursing up her arms had spread to her neck, glowing faintly under the fluorescent light. Liana worked frantically, running scans and analyzing blood samples, but the results made no sense. "This isn't a disease," Liana said, her voice taut with frustration. It's something else. Her cells are changing at an accelerated rate, rewriting themselves. It's like her body doesn't recognize itself anymore." "What does that mean?" Everett asked, looming over her shoulder. Liana shook her head, the glow of her tablet casting harsh shadows across her face. "I don't know. But whatever's happening, it's not just physical. It's spreading through her nervous system. She's connected to something." "Connected to what?" Everett's voice was sharp, but it carried an undertone of dread. Liana didn't answer. Instead, she glanced at Maria, who had begun muttering under her breath, her eyes glazed and unfocused. I moved closer to hear her. "It's watching us," she whispered, her lips barely moving. "It sees everything. It wants... Maria?" I crouched beside her, trying to meet her gaze. "What are you talking about? What sees us?" Her eyes snapped to mine, and for a moment, they weren't her eyes. They glowed faintly like twin embers, flickering with an alien light. "It's hungry," she said, her voice a low rasp. "We woke it up." The words sent a chill down my spine. Before I could respond, she convulsed, her body arching violently as a guttural scream tore from her throat. Liana and I grabbed her, trying to hold her down as her limbs spasmed uncontrollably. Her skin burned hot to the touch, the blue veins pulsing erratically beneath the surface. "Get her sedated," Everett barked. Liana fumbled with a syringe, injecting a dose of sedative into Maria's arm. The thrashing slowed, then stopped, but her breathing remained ragged, each exhale a rasping wheeze. Her head lolled to the side, and for a moment the room was silent except for the hum of the ship's systems. Then the lights flickered. A low, resonant vibration coursed through the ship, making the walls tremble. It was the same sound we'd heard outside the spires, but louder now, more insistent. It felt alive, as though the sphere itself was groaning in its sleep. "What the hell was that?" Zeke asked, his voice cracking. Everett moved to the comm panel, his jaw tight. "Maria wasn't wrong. Whatever's here, it knows we're here too." As if in response, the vibration deepened, a rhythmic pulse that seemed to come from every direction at once. The lights dimmed, casting the corridors of the Resolve in a sickly amber glow. The hum wasn't just a sound anymore. It was a presence, pressing down on us, crawling under our skin. Liana's console beeped, drawing her attention. Her face paled as she read the data. The ship's systems are being overridden. Something's accessing our power supply. How's that possible? Everett demanded, leaning over her shoulder. It's not just the ship, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. It's Maria. She's acting like a conduit. Something's using her to tap into our systems. Before Everett could respond, Maria's eyes snapped open. She sat up abruptly, her movements unnaturally fluid, and turned to face us. Her pupils were gone, replaced by orbs of pure, glowing blue light. When she spoke, her voice was layered, a discordant harmony that sent shivers down my spine. "It's awake," she said. The room plunged into chaos. Zeke backed away, his hand instinctively reaching for the sidearm at his belt, while Liana scrambled to her feet, knocking over her chair. Everett moved toward Maria, his expression a mix of fear and determination. "Maria, listen to me," he said, his voice steady but firm. "Whatever's happening, we can help you. But you need to fight this." Maria tilted her head as though considering his words. Then she smiled, a slow, unnatural curl of her lips. "You don't understand," she said. "There is no Maria, not anymore." She rose to her feet, the blue veins crawling across her skin, glowing brighter with each passing second. The temperature in the room dropped sharply, frost forming on the edges of the medical bay's monitors. My breath fogged in the air as I took a step back, every instinct screaming at me to run. Then she moved. It was too fast to process. One moment she was standing, and the next she was across the room, her hand around Zeke's throat. He struggled against her grip, but it was no use. Her strength was inhuman. She lifted him effortlessly, her glowing eyes locking onto his. "You are fuel," she said, her voice echoing with an otherworldly resonance. Before anyone could react, tendrils erupted from her back, long and sinuous, glowing with the same unnatural light. They writhed in the air like living things, lashing out and embedding themselves in the walls and floor. The ship groaned in protest as the tendrils pulsed, siphoning energy directly from its systems. "Zeke!" I shouted, moving toward him. But one of the tendrils lashed out, striking the ground inches from my feet. I stumbled back, the air crackling with energy. Everett didn't hesitate. He raised his sidearm and fired, the sharp crack of the shot echoing through the bay. The bullet struck Maria in the shoulder, but she didn't flinch. Instead, she turned to him, her smile widening. "Your weapons are useless," she said. "You cannot stop what has already begun." With a final pulse of energy, the lights in the medical bay died, plunging us into darkness. The only illumination came from Maria, her glowing veins casting eerie shadows across the room. Then, with a deafening roar, the ship shook violently, throwing us to the ground. When the tremors subsided, Maria was gone. All that remained were the scorch marks on the walls and floor, where her tendrils had burrowed, glowing faintly in the darkness. The hum was louder now, reverberating through the entire ship like a heartbeat. "She's gone," Zeke said, his voice trembling as he clutched his bruised throat. "What the hell do we do now?" Everett stood slowly, his expression grim. "We find her," he said, "and we stop whatever this is before it takes all of us." But even as he said the words, I could feel it, an itch beneath my skin, faint but persistent. It wasn't just Maria. It was inside me too, inside all of us. The resolve was dying. The lights flickered sporadically, casting the corridors in erratic bursts of illumination before plunging them back into darkness. The hum that had haunted us since we entered the sphere was now a constant, oppressive roar, vibrating through the walls, the floor, and even the air itself. It felt alive like a heartbeat, and each pulse brought a deeper sense of dread. We were out of time. Everett's voice crackled over the comms as Zeke and I sprinted through the ship's twisting passageways. The engines are failing. Life support is down to 40%. If we don't contain this... He stopped, his voice strained. If we can't stop her, we're not making it out of here. I didn't respond. What could I say? The truth was, none of us believed we were leaving the sphere. Not anymore. Zeke ran beside me, clutching his side where one of Maria's tendrils had grazed him. The wound was shallow, but it was already spreading, bluish veins creeping outward like frost on glass. He didn't say anything about it, and I didn't ask. We both knew what it meant. We reached the main hold, where the bulk of the ship's power systems were housed. The doors hung half open, the mechanisms jammed by the tendrils that had snaked their way inside. They pulsed faintly, feeding on the ship's energy, their glow illuminating the room in sickly blue light. Maria was there, or what was left of her. She stood at the center of the room, her form barely recognizable. Her body had elongated, her limbs stretched and distorted, and the glowing veins now covered her entirely, branching out like the roots of some grotesque tree. Tendrils extended from her back, writhing and twitching as they burrowed deeper into the ship's core. The air around her shimmered with heat, distorting her shape, but her eyes were clear, brilliant orbs of blue light, unblinking and fixed on us. "You shouldn't have come," she said, her voice layered and discordant, as though a dozen voices spoke through her at once. "It's too late. You belong to it now." "Maria, stop this," Everett's voice barked through the comms. He joined us, his weapon raised, sweat dripping down his temple. "You're not in control. Whatever this thing is, fight it." Maria, or the thing she had become, laughed. The sound was hollow and terrible, echoing through the hold. "There's nothing to fight. I am it, and it is me." The tendrils surged, the ship groaning in response as more systems failed. Sparks rained down from the ceiling, and the hum intensified, a deafening pulse that seemed to emanate from Maria herself. "She's going to tear the ship apart," Zeke said, his voice shaking. "We have to do something." But what? We had no weapons that could stop her. The tendrils moved too fast, too erratically, and even if we could get close enough, there was no guarantee we could sever her connection to the ship or the sphere. Then Liana's voice came through the comms, urgent and breathless. "I found something, an override sequence. If we can trigger it, it might sever the ship's systems from whatever's controlling her. But we'll lose all power in the process." Everett didn't hesitate. "Do it." "No," Zeke said, stepping forward. "If we shut everything down, we'll be trapped here. There's no way we'll get out." Everett's expression was grim. "If we don't, we're dead anyway." Maria tilted her head, her glowing eyes narrowing. "You think you can stop me?" she asked, her voice dripping with contempt. "This vessel is nothing. The sphere will consume you. You are fuel, nothing more. Her tendrils lashed out, one of them striking Zeke and throwing him against the wall. He cried out, the veins on his arm flaring brighter, but he forced himself to his feet, clutching a nearby console for support. "Do it," Everett said again, his gaze fixed on Maria. "Liana, now." The lights flickered violently as Liana initiated the sequence. The hum reached an unbearable pitch, the walls vibrating as though the entire ship was tearing itself apart. Maria screamed, a sound of pure rage and pain, as the tendrils spasmed, the glowing veins pulsing erratically. I felt the ship shudder as power systems failed one by one, the lights plunging us into near-total darkness. For a moment, everything was silent. Then the sphere awakened. The hum we had heard before was nothing compared to this. It wasn't just sound, it was a presence, vast and unknowable, pressing into my mind, my body, my very soul. Images flooded my vision, fractured glimpses of what had come before. The sphere's creators, their desperate attempts to harness the power of their star, their transformation into something inhuman. And at the center of it all, the star itself, pulsing with an unnatural hunger, a living thing that consumed everything it touched. Maria wasn't the source. She was a vessel. The sphere had turned her into its mouthpiece, its harbinger. And now it had awoken. The tendrils writhed violently, tearing through the walls and floor as the sphere fed on the last remnants of the ship's energy. Sparks rained down and the air grew thick with heat and static. "Get to the escape pod," Everett shouted, his voice barely audible over the chaos. "Go." I hesitated, glancing back at Maria. For a moment, I thought I saw her, truly her, beneath the glowing mass, her face contorted with pain and desperation. "Help me," she whispered, her voice faint and human. But it was too late. Everett grabbed my arm, dragging me toward the pod. Zeke was already inside, his movements sluggish but determined. As we sealed the hatch and launched into the void, the resolve buckled behind us, the tendrils consuming it entirely. Through the pod's window, I saw the sphere for what it truly was, a living, breathing entity, its surface rippling with unnatural light as it fed on the energy of the dying star. And as the ship was pulled into its depths, I realized the truth. The sphere wasn't a prison. It was a predator, and we had been its prey. The hum faded as we drifted into the silence of space, the sphere receding into the distance. But I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't over. The glow beneath my skin told me so. It wasn't just the sphere that had awoken. It was inside us now, and it was hungry. The Novara drifted silently into the yawning darkness of the dark zone, a place so void of light and life that even the most advanced sensors on board struggled to produce coherent readings. It felt wrong, unnatural, as if they had crossed a threshold into a part of space that wasn't meant to be explored. Captain Sorin Kazem stared out of the observation window, his reflection a ghostly silhouette against the abyss. The starless expanse stretched infinitely, an oppressive void that seemed to swallow even thought. Around him, the crew worked methodically, their voices subdued as if they feared the silence might listen. Dr. Amina Thorne, their biologist and chief xenologist, sat at a terminal across from Soren, Her brow furrowed as she reviewed the atmospheric scans from the surrounding space. The data was strange. No particles, no radiation, no debris. Space itself seemed sterile, stripped clean of everything. "This isn't just emptiness," she said quietly, breaking the silence. Her tone carried an edge of unease that drew Soren's attention. It's as though something is actively suppressing matter. Even the instruments are struggling to function out here. There's nothing natural about this. Soren nodded but said nothing, his gaze returning to the endless black. The mission briefing had been simple enough: chart the region, document anomalies, and assess its potential for human expansion. It had seemed straightforward, even routine. But now, with the weight of the dark zone pressing on the ship, he felt a creeping doubt. The first sign of trouble came 12 hours into their drift. The comms crackled to life, filling the bridge with a harsh burst of static. Everyone froze. The signal wasn't from the Novara. "Help! Anyone! Trapped!" The voice was garbled, barely comprehensible, but unmistakably desperate. It repeated several times before the static swallowed it again. The crew exchanged uneasy glances. "That shouldn't be possible," said Commander Rafe, the ship's tactical officer. He adjusted the controls at his station, trying to isolate the signal. "No known colonies or vessels have come this far. Hell, there's no record of anything even attempting it. And yet..." He gestured toward the coordinates that accompanied the transmission. The numbers floated on his console, ominous and cold. Soren leaned forward. "Run a cross-check on that frequency. See if it matches anything in the archive." After a tense moment, Amina's voice broke the silence. "It's not a match, but the signal pattern." She hesitated, her fingers hovering over the console. "It's human adjacent. There's no way to pinpoint its origin, but it's coming from inside the dark zone." Soren straightened. "Plot a course. If someone needs help, we can't ignore it." The crew obeyed reluctantly. As the Novara closed in on the source, the oppressive feeling of the dark zone grew heavier. The very air aboard the ship seemed thicker, as though the void outside was trying to seep through the hull and fill the spaces between them. The faint hum of the engines grew louder, almost like a heartbeat. No one spoke. The ship's scanners picked up the object first. It was massive, floating adrift in the darkness like a monolith forgotten by time. The Arcana. The name was stenciled faintly on its hull, barely visible beneath layers of frost and scorch marks. The crew of the Novara stared at the ghostly wreck in stunned silence. The Arcana had disappeared decades ago during one of humanity's first expeditions into deep space. Its fate had remained a mystery, until now. The ship was in terrible condition. Sections of the hull were shredded, with jagged metal edges that looked like they had been torn apart by something with immense force. Gashes ran the length of its body, deep wounds in what should have been impervious alloys. And yet, despite the damage, faint lights flickered sporadically across its exterior. "Life signs?" Soren asked, his voice steady. Amina hesitated before answering. "Not exactly. I'm picking up energy readings inside, but they're erratic. No definitive human signatures. Could be survivors," Rafe added. "Or it could be a trap." "We won't know until we board," Soren said firmly. "Prepare for docking. Keep weapons on standby." The Navara latched onto the Arcana with a metallic groan, the docking clamps securing the two ships together. The crew suited up quickly, their movements mechanical, almost ritualistic. No one voiced what they were all thinking, that stepping onto that ship might be the last thing they ever did. The airlock hissed open, and the boarding party stepped into the cold, silent corridors of the Arcana. Their helmet lights cut through the darkness, revealing a landscape of death and decay. Frost covered the walls, and the floor was littered with debris, tools, shattered equipment, and, most disturbingly, frozen bodies. The corpses floated lifelessly, their faces twisted in terror, mouths agape, as if caught mid-scream. Amina knelt by one of the bodies, her gloved hand brushing against the frozen flesh. "No external wounds," she murmured, her voice filtered through her helmet's comms. "It's like they froze in fear." Soren moved deeper into the corridor, his weapon raised. The Arcana felt wrong. The silence wasn't just the absence of sound, it was oppressive, a tangible weight pressing down on them. And then there were the marks, long, deep gashes carved into the walls and floor, as though something enormous and vicious had clawed its way through the ship. As they pressed forward, the oppressive atmosphere grew worse. The lights of the Navara crew flickered against something organic on the walls. It was subtle at first, barely visible growths clinging to the corners of the corridor. But as they moved deeper, the growths became more pronounced, branching out like veins. They pulsed faintly, as though alive. The team reached the cargo hold where the signal originated. The doors were jammed, twisted inward like they had been pried open from the inside. Soren signaled for the engineers to cut through, and after several tense minutes, the bulkhead gave way. What lay beyond made everyone freeze. The cargo hold was enormous, but the space had been transformed into something unnatural. The walls were covered in a thick, fleshy substance, pulsating and wet. The air reeked of rot and ammonia, and the floor was slick with a dark, viscous fluid. At the center of the room was the source of the signal, a beacon, ancient and alien in design, half submerged in the organic mass. It pulsed faintly, emitting the same garbled message they had heard earlier. And then, the sound came, a wet, slithering noise from the shadows. Something moved. The atmosphere in the cargo hold was stifling, the air thick with an unidentifiable stench that clung to their suits. The pulsating organic growths lining the walls seemed to shiver in response to their movements, as though the ship itself was aware of their presence. The distorted beacon at the center of the room continued to emit its eerie, fragmented signal, the sound reverberating unnaturally in the confined space. Captain Soren Kazem raised a hand to signal silence, his weapon held steady as his eyes scanned the dark recesses of the hold. The team stood frozen, their helmet lights slicing through the oppressive darkness, illuminating patches of the grotesque growths that covered every surface. The sound came again, a wet, slithering noise, closer now. The shadows in the far corner of the room shifted, and a figure staggered into the light. The crew tensed, weapons aimed, but the figure raised trembling hands, a wordless plea for mercy. It was a man, gaunt and filthy, his tattered suit hanging off his emaciated frame. His sunken eyes darted wildly between the crew, filled with a mixture of relief and terror. "Help me," he croaked, his voice raw and broken. "It's still here." Before Soren could respond, more figures emerged from the darkness. 3 in total, each in varying states of disarray. One clutched a makeshift weapon, a length of jagged metal, and another limped heavily, their leg wrapped in what looked like hastily torn strips of fabric. Their eyes were wide and hollow, faces etched with desperation. "Who are you?" Soren demanded, his voice steady despite the tension. "What happened here?" The man who had spoken first collapsed to his knees, clutching his chest as though speaking had drained the last of his strength. He began, but his words were cut off by a low, guttural vibration that seemed to emanate from the walls themselves. The survivors stiffened, their heads snapping toward the sound. "It knows we're here," one of them whispered, panic creeping into their voice. "You shouldn't have come. You've doomed us all." A sound like tearing flesh echoed through the hold, followed by a series of rapid, wet clicks. The crew instinctively formed a defensive circle, weapons raised as the air grew heavier. Soren's heart pounded as his eyes darted toward the shadows where the sound had originated. Then it appeared. It moved with unnatural speed, slithering into the light before any of them could react. The creature was unlike anything they had ever encountered, a mass of glistening, sinewy flesh that pulsed and writhed as though alive. Its body was segmented like an insect's, but its surface was slick and membranous, reflecting the beams of their helmet lights. Long, needle-like appendages jutted from its sides, twitching erratically as it advanced. It had no discernible head, no eyes or mouth, yet it moved with terrifying purpose, as though it could see them clearly. The survivors screamed, scrambling backward as the creature coiled itself like a predator preparing to strike. "Fire!" Soren barked. The cargo hold erupted into chaos as plasma rounds and kinetic bolts tore through the air. The creature shrieked, a high-pitched, bone-rattling sound that seemed to come from everywhere at once. Chunks of its flesh were blown away, splattering the walls with a thick black ichor. But the creature didn't stop. The wounds on its body began to seal almost immediately, the damaged flesh knitting itself back together with grotesque efficiency. One of the survivors wasn't fast enough. The creature lashed out with a needle-like appendage, impaling the man through the chest. His scream was cut short as his body convulsed violently, his skin bubbling and blistering as the creature's venom coursed through him. Within seconds, he was reduced to a quivering, liquefied mass that seeped into the floor. "Move!" Soren shouted, firing another round into the creature. It recoiled slightly, giving the crew enough time to retreat toward the corridor. Amina grabbed one of the survivors, a woman clutching her injured leg, and hauled her forward, her own breath ragged with fear. The group fled through the winding corridors of the Arcana, the creature's guttural cries echoing behind them. It was fast, faster than any of them had anticipated, its slick body undulating with horrifying grace as it pursued them. The walls seemed to close in, the organic growths pulsing in rhythm with the creature's movements, as though the ship itself was alive and complicit in the hunt. They reached a junction, and Soren slammed his fist against the control panel to seal the bulkhead. The heavy doors groaned shut, cutting off the corridor just as the creature lunged forward, its appendages slammed against the reinforced metal, the impact reverberating through the walls. For a moment, the group stood in stunned silence, their labored breathing the only sound. "It won't stop," one of the survivors gasped, clutching their side. "It never stops. It's part of this place. It is this place." "What are you talking about?" Amina demanded, her voice trembling with equal parts fear and frustration. "What is that thing?" The survivor shook his head, his eyes glassy. "We thought we could escape. We thought we could fight it. But it's everywhere. The ship, the walls. It's all connected. It's all alive." Soren clenched his mind racing. They had faced hostile environments before, even hostile life forms, but this was something else entirely. The Arcana wasn't just a derelict ship. It was a trap, a living organism that had claimed its crew and turned them into prey. The creature's shriek pierced the air again, louder this time, more insistent. The bulkhead shuddered under its assault, and Soren knew they didn't have much time. He turned to the group, his expression grim. "We need to find a way off this ship," he said. "Now." But even as he spoke, the walls around them began to shift, the organic growths spreading and thickening. The Arcana wasn't going to let them go without a fight. The Arcana had become a labyrinth of flesh and fear. The corridors that once served as the arteries of a starship were now unrecognizable, their metallic walls overtaken by a pulsating, organic mass. The crew of the Novara and the few remaining members of the Lyra crew moved cautiously, their weapons raised as they navigated the twisting, shifting passages. Every step felt like an intrusion, the floor beneath them soft and wet, pulsating faintly as though alive. The air was suffocating, thick with a nauseating stench that seemed to seep into their suits. Soren led the group, his grip firm on his plasma rifle, his mind racing with calculations and doubts. Behind him, Amina supported one of the injured survivors, her expression tight with exhaustion and worry. Commander Rafe brought up the rear, his eyes darting to every shadow, his knuckles white around his weapon. The creature had fallen silent for now, but its presence was palpable. It was somewhere within the ship, watching, waiting, and it wasn't alone. The first sign of the infection came when one of the survivors, a man named Jex, stumbled. He leaned against the wall for support, his breath ragged. "I'm fine," he said when Amina approached him, his voice tight with pain. But the red rash creeping up his neck told a different story. The skin around it was swollen and mottled, faintly pulsating like the walls around them. Amina's face darkened. "You're not fine. Sit down." "Let me look at it." Jex resisted at first, but when his knees buckled, he had no choice but to comply. Amina knelt beside him, pulling a diagnostic scanner from her pack. As the device hummed to life, Soren stepped closer, his eyes narrowing as he noticed the rash spreading further. "How long have you felt like this?" Soren asked. Jex hesitated. Since it touched me. Just a scrape. I thought..." He winced, clutching his side. "I thought it wasn't deep." Amina's scanner beeped and her face paled as she read the results. "This isn't just an infection, it's..." She trailed off, her throat working as she struggled to find the words. "It's rewriting him. His cells are transforming." "What does that mean?" Soren demanded, his voice sharp. "It means he's becoming one of them," Amina said, her voice barely above a whisper. Before anyone could respond, Jex cried out, his body convulsing violently. His skin began to ripple, bulges forming beneath the surface as though something was trying to claw its way out. The crew backed away in horror as Jex's screams turned into guttural growls. His eyes rolled back in his head, and his hands twisted into claw-like appendages, the skin peeling away to reveal sinewy, glistening flesh. "Shoot him," Rafe shouted, raising his weapon. "No," Amina cried, stepping in front of Jex. "We don't know if—" Jex lunged forward, his movements inhumanly fast. Amina barely scrambled out of the way as Soren fired, the plasma bolt striking Jex square in the chest. He collapsed to the floor, his body writhing as it continued to shift and mutate. More shots followed, Rafe and Soren unloading their weapons, until Jex was nothing more than a smoking, unrecognizable heap. The silence that followed was deafening. Amina stared at the remains, her hands trembling. "We don't even know if he was still himself," she said, her voice breaking. Soren placed a hand on her shoulder, his expression grim. "He was gone, Amina. You saw it." The group pressed on, but the encounter had shaken them. They avoided looking at one another, the unspoken truth weighing heavily on their minds. Any one of them could be next. The infection was silent, insidious, and there was no way to know who might already be compromised. Paranoia began to seep into the group. It started with whispers, stolen glances, and subtle movements away from one another. The survivors of the Lyra crew grew increasingly hostile, accusing the Navarra team of bringing the creature's wrath upon them. Tensions boiled over when one of them, a woman named Marin, refused to share what little food she had left. "We're all going to die anyway," she spat, clutching the ration pack to her chest. "Why should I waste this on you?" Rafe stepped forward, his weapon raised. "Put it down, Marin. We're all in this together." "Like hell we are," she screamed, backing away. "You're not one of us. You don't know what we've been through. You don't—" Her words were cut off as the wall behind her shifted. A fleshy tendril shot out, wrapping around her waist and dragging her into the darkness before anyone could react. Her screams echoed down the corridor, abruptly silenced by a wet, crunching sound. The group froze, their weapons trained on the darkened passage. The creature was near, and it was picking them off one by one. "We can't stay here," Soren said, his voice low but firm. "Keep moving. Stay together." But staying together proved impossible. The infection continued to spread, paranoia fracturing the group further. One by one, the survivors turned on each other, their fear and desperation driving them to violence. It was as though the creature wasn't just hunting them, it was manipulating them, feeding off their mistrust and fear. The Arcana itself seemed to conspire against them, the corridors twisting and shifting, leading them in circles. The organic growths on the walls became more aggressive, sprouting barbed tendrils that lashed out at anyone who came too close. The ship was alive, and it was determined to keep them trapped. By the time they reached what they thought was the engineering deck, only a handful of them remained. Soren, Amina, Rafe, and two of the Lyra crew, a man named Garin and a woman named Ida, stood in the dim, pulsating room, their faces gaunt with exhaustion. The reactor loomed before them, a faint hope of escape. But even here, the infection was spreading. The machinery was coated in a thin layer of organic growth, the controls barely recognizable beneath the fleshy mass. And as they approached, the familiar, wet, slithering sound echoed through the chamber. The creature had been waiting for them. The reactor chamber was a grotesque cathedral of flesh and machinery, an unholy union of metal and organic growths that pulsed with a heartbeat too slow, too deliberate to be human. The walls were alive, glistening with a viscous, amber fluid that dripped down the exposed machinery, pooling on the floor in shimmering puddles. Faint echoes of their own footsteps reverberated unnaturally, as though the ship itself were mocking them, amplifying their fear. Soren Kazim stood at the center of the chamber, his plasma rifle heavy in his hands, the weight of their hopeless situation pressing down on his shoulders. Around him, the surviving crew, Amina, Rafe, and Ida, moved with the cautious precision of cornered animals. Garin, one of the last of the Lyra crew, leaned heavily against the wall, his face pale, his breathing shallow. The infection was spreading through him, his body betraying him with every labored breath. They were running out of time, and the creature knew it. The reactor loomed before them, its core barely visible beneath the encroaching growths. The controls were coated in a thin membrane that seemed to shudder as they approached, as though warning them away. But it was their only chance. Soren glanced at Amina, her face drawn but resolute. She nodded, understanding what needed to be done without him having to say a word. "This is suicide," Rafe muttered, his voice tight with frustration. "We can't outrun it, and we sure as hell can't fight it. Even if we blow this thing to hell, there's no guarantee we'll make it out alive." "We won't," Soren said quietly. His calm, matter-of-fact tone silenced the room. "Not all of us. But if we don't do this, it doesn't matter. It will spread. It will infect more ships, more colonies. We have to stop it here." Ida stepped forward, her hand trembling as she gripped her weapon. "Then let's get it over with." The plan was simple in theory. Overload the reactor, rig a manual detonation, and use the resulting explosion to propel the Navara, their only means of escape, out of the dark zone. But the reactor was alive now, fused with the organism that had consumed the Arcana. It wouldn't go down without a fight. As Amina began working on the controls, peeling away the membrane with a surgical laser, the sound came. A low, guttural vibration that made the air in the chamber thrum. The creature was near. Soren motioned for Rafe and Ida to cover the entrances, their weapons trained on the darkness beyond the fleshy walls. The vibration grew louder, morphing into a series of clicks and wet slithers that seemed to echo from every direction. "It's watching us," Amina whispered, her hands steady but her voice betraying her fear. "Keep going," Soren urged. "We'll hold it off." The first attack was sudden. A tendril shot out from the shadows, razor-sharp and impossibly fast. Rafe fired instinctively, the plasma bolt severing the appendage mid-air, but more emerged, writhing and snapping like the limbs of a maddened predator. Ida screamed as one of the tendrils wrapped around her leg, yanking her off her feet. Soren turned, firing into the mass as Ida struggled, her cries turning to choking gasps as the tendril tightened around her throat. "Cut it!" Soren shouted, tossing her his combat knife. With a desperate slash, Ida severed the appendage, collapsing to the floor as the creature recoiled, shrieking in pain. But the reprieve was short-lived. The walls themselves began to shift, the organic growths peeling away to reveal more of the creature's grotesque form. It was everywhere, an amorphous mass of sinew and muscle that twisted and writhed, its appendages extending from the walls, the floor, even the ceiling. "It's trying to trap us," Rafe yelled, firing into the walls as the creature advanced. Amina's voice cut through the chaos. "I've almost got it. Just a few more seconds." But seconds were a luxury they didn't have. Garen, barely able to stand, suddenly convulsed, his body jerking violently as the infection overtook him. His screams were inhuman, a guttural, wet sound as his skin split open, exposing the writhing mass beneath. He turned toward them, his face unrecognizable, his movements no longer his own. Soren didn't hesitate. He fired, the plasma bolt tearing through what was left of Garen's chest. The infected man collapsed, his body twitching as it was absorbed into the fleshy floor. Soren swallowed hard, forcing himself to look away. Amina's voice rang out. "The reactor's set. We've got 5 minutes." The words were a small victory, but Soren knew the hardest part was yet to come. Someone had to stay behind to trigger the manual override, ensuring the detonation sequence wasn't interrupted. He turned to Amina, her wide eyes meeting his, understanding dawning immediately. "No," she said, shaking her head. "No, Soren. You don't... There's no time to argue," he said firmly, stepping toward the controls. "You're the only one who can get the ship running. You have to get them out of here." "I'm not leaving you," she shouted, her voice breaking. "You don't have a choice." Soren's voice was sharp, cutting through the panic. He softened, placing a hand on her shoulder. "You'll make it out, and you'll tell them what happened here. Someone has to know." Before she could protest further, another shriek filled the chamber. The creature surged forward, its mass writhing and expanding, filling the space with its grotesque presence. Rafe and Ida fired desperately, their shots barely slowing its advance. "Go!" Soren yelled, shoving Amina toward the exit. "Get to the Novara." With tears streaming down her face, Amina hesitated for only a moment before obeying. She grabbed Ida, dragging her toward the corridor, Rafe covering their retreat as they fled. Soren turned back to the reactor, his hands moving swiftly over the controls. The creature lunged, its massive body descending upon him, but he held his ground, firing into its mass to buy a few precious seconds. The reactor began to hum, the growing vibration shaking the chamber. Soren felt the heat rising, the telltale signs of imminent overload. He allowed himself one final thought of the crew, of Amina, before the creature enveloped him, its tendrils piercing his body as the reactor erupted in a blinding explosion. The Novara was already hurtling away, the shockwave from the detonation propelling it out of the dark zone. Amina sat in the pilot's seat, her hands trembling as she guided the ship through the black void. Tears blurred her vision, but she didn't stop. She couldn't. Behind her, the Arcana was consumed in fire and light, the explosion ripping through the ship and the creature that had claimed it. But as the Novara emerged into the faint glow of known space, Amina felt a cold dread settle over her. In the silence of the cockpit, she caught a glimpse of her reflection in the console. A faint rash had begun to spread along her neck, pulsating faintly in time with her heartbeat. The creature wasn't gone. It had survived, and it was still hungry.